Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Sorry for not posting for so long, but today let's take a dive into the anatomy of the blood vessels. So in this video, I'm just going to go over the functions and the structures of the arteries, veins, and capillaries. And then at the end, I'm going to have like this comparison chart that is going to compare the three, and that way we're going to be able to look at the differences and the similarities, and so that'll help deepen our understanding of these three. You might be wondering what the purpose is learning about these in the first place, the learning about the structures and the anatomies and the functions of the blood vessels, because in the end, does it really matter? And the answer is yes, it does, because these structures and these anatomies and functions help us deeper understand how the human body works, and learning about this is going to tie into a lot of other things that we will learn in the future. And so learning about the different structures and functions will help us more understand the body and how it works, as well as how everything works together to keep us functioning. So now we're going to be talking about the functions of these blood vessels, aka the arteries, veins, and capillaries. And so here I try to make this little image so that it's a little bit more easier to understand the difference between these three. So, or at five, I guess, because, okay, there's the artery, there's the arterioles, capillaries, venules, and the veins, right? So the artery is just anything that's taking blood away from the heart, which I'll get into more later. And arterioles are like kind of like mini arteries that come out of the arteries. Then the venules are like mini veins that come out of the vein. So they're like smaller, like they're kind of like branches of a vein where they get really tiny and really thin. And these arterioles and venules, where they combine is the capillary or the capillary bed. And so this capillary or capillary bed is where like all the transfusion happens, as in where the oxygen is delivered to the tissue and then waste is taken out, etc. And so let's just dive a little bit more deeper into the functions of these blood vessels. So here's just a little synopsis of the functions of the three. The function of the artery is to take blood from the heart to the body, and so to deliver blood that is pumped through the heart to anywhere else in the body. And as I mentioned in a previous video, this blood doesn't always have to be oxygenated because, for example, the artery that takes blood from the heart to the lungs so that it can give away its waste through our exhalation, that is deoxygenated blood. And so arteries don't always have to have oxygenated blood, and same thing for veins, they don't always have to have deoxygenated blood. But you can check out my other video for more information and more explanation on that. And the largest artery in the human body is the aorta, which comes out of the heart kind of like at the top, and it goes downward to give blood to all of the tissues and all the organs lower than the heart, which is most of them. Next, the function of the veins is to take all the blood from the body to the heart, and the longest veins are found in the legs because that would make sense since the legs are the longest parts of our body. So the longest veins are found in our legs. And the function of the capillaries is to give nutrients to cells and then take their waste. And they're attached to venules and arterioles. And I actually have this little like green box at the bottom right, which kind of like just puts it together. Venules is the name given to like the smaller branches of veins. Arterioles are the name given to smaller branches of the arteries. And then the purple part is like the capillaries, which connects the two. Before we start learning about the structures, we have to know some basic terminology in order to understand it. And so even though this looks like a lot, it's just some simple terms that we need to know before we get started. So first of all, we have our tunica intima or tunica interna, which is like this innermost layer. And so it's responsible for making sure that there's like a smooth flow of blood within the veins, arteries, or capillaries. Next, we have the tunica media, which is like this middle layer of the veins and arteries. And so overall, it's responsible for like structure as well as like nutrition of the arteries. Lastly, we have the tunica adventitia or tunica externa, which is like these outer layers of the arteries, veins, or capillaries. And the thing about this is it's mostly there for like protection and structure, and to make sure that that these arteries and veins and capillaries aren't just like free and loose within the body. It's just like to make sure that it's like attached to something, which we'll discuss later. But basically, interna is for smooth blood flow, media is for like nutrition, and then adventitia or externa is for structure and protection. And so, even though it says that the tunica intima or tunica interna is like the innermost layer, same thing for media and then externa, it's not just like one layer, it's a group of layers that make this innermost layer. Next, we have the lumen, which is like the channel or the hole of the vein or artery or capillary. And so, this is like where the blood goes, like, this is where the blood flows from. Next, we have the smooth muscle, which is in charge of vasodilation and vasoconstriction. And so we're just gonna break these two words up real quick. Vaso means relating to a blood vessel, and then vasodilation, so dilation means to make the vessel bigger, constriction means to make the vessel smaller. So vasodilation means to like make the muscle or the vessel bigger, and then vasoconstriction would be to make the vessel smaller. And so smooth muscle is in charge of this, in charge of making sure that this is happening. Next, we have the endothelial cells. And so I like to think of it as the brain, and then the smooth muscle is kind of like the body. So the endothelial cells tell the smooth muscle what to do. And in this case, the endothelial cells like signal the smooth muscle to like constrict or dilate as needed. And then the endothelial cells also have another function, which is that they are the innermost layer of veins, arteries, and capillaries. And so they make sure that the blood flow is smooth and that it's not being stopped, etc. And that there's like no blocks, And next we have the connective tissue / elastic or collagenous fibers. And so the function of these fibers or tissues is to provide structural support. And then lastly, we have the elastic fibers. And so what these do is that they help maintain pressure within the arteries, veins, and it basically does this interesting thing where, say, like the heart is pumping, right? And then the arteries are going to have like really high pressure, maybe more than they need. And so this pressure could be like bad for the artery or, for the structure of the artery. So what these elastic fibers do is it takes out this excess energy and it just uses it for the next pump instead, so that this excess energy isn't damaging the structure of the artery. And then same thing for like veins. And so yeah, these are like some of the basic structures. So first off, we're going to talk about the structure of the artery. So to explain the structure of an artery, let's first talk about its function. And so the function of an artery is to deliver blood from the heart to the rest of the body. And so obviously this means that the pressure in an artery is going to be much, much higher than that of a vein, because the blood is coming straight from the heart into the arteries. And so all of this pressure is being, distributed through these arteries. And so the artery has very high pressures. Let's get started with the anatomy of the artery. And so in the functioning of the artery, there are 7 key walls that play a crucial role. And these walls are divided into 3 parts or 3 groupings. The tunica interna or intima, which are the inner walls, the tunica media, which are the middle walls, and then the tunica externa, which are these outer walls. And so in the tunica intima, we have the endothelial wall, the subendothelial wall, and the internal elastic lamina. And so for the endothelial wall, we have this as the innermost wall that is surrounding the lumen. And so this endothelial wall makes sure that the blood passing through the lumen is getting a smooth lining to pass through, so that there are no clot formations and so that the blood can get where it needs to be as quickly as possible. And this wall plays a crucial role because it has two roles. Not only does it make sure that the blood gets wherever it needs to be as quickly as possible, it also signals to the smooth muscle to constrict and dilate the artery, which I'll talk about later. Next, we have the subendothelial wall. And so sub means under, and so subendothelial wall would be under the endothelial wall. So this wall acts as a structural support, and it makes sure that the artery doesn't collapse in on itself due to the pressure that the artery has to sustain. And this wall is made up of connective tissue and then elastic and collagenous fibers. Third up, we have the internal elastic lamina, which is like the flexible layer. And so the internal elastic lamina and the external elastic lamina both play basically the same role, which is to act as a flexible layer for veins and arteries. And what this does is to make sure that the arteries and veins can adapt to its needs and its surroundings. Next up, we have the smooth muscle, which is part of the tunica media. And the smooth muscle is responsible for vasodilation and vasoconstriction. And then, so just to repeat what I said before, vasodilation means to dilate the vessel, because vaso stands for vessel, and then dilation. Vasoconstriction is for constricting the vessel. And so dilation is to make it bigger, and constriction is to make it smaller. And so, as I said before, the endothelial wall signals to the smooth muscle to dilate or constrict the wall. And this is so that the artery can adapt to necessary changes needed, and so that the artery can pump blood efficiently. And so, just to go back to the analogy that we made before, the endothelial wall is kind of like the brain, while the smooth muscle is kind of like the body that acts upon the brain's requests. And then fifth, we have the external elastic lamina, which, as I said before, is the flexible layer. And it also prevents damage by helping it withstand pressure changes. So as we know, artery has really high pressures of blood coming in, so the external and internal elastic lamina help keep the artery flexible so that it can withstand pressure changes. Sixth, we have the connective tissue, which anchors the arteries to surrounding structures, and it also provides support and strength to the artery. And lastly, we have the vasa vasorum, which are kind of like mini arteries for the arteries. So if you think about it, these arteries need a source of energy themselves, right? So these arteries actually have smaller arteries called vasa vasorum, and these vasa vasorum provide blood and energy to the arteries so that they can function. And so when I learned about this, I was curious. I was like, well, if the bigger arteries need smaller arteries, then don't the smaller arteries need even more miniature arteries? So I looked into it and I found out that these big arteries and these vasa vasorum, as in the smaller arteries, help each other out by providing each other energy, and so they work together to function together. And so this is the anatomy of the artery. So before talking about the structure of a vein, let's once again review its purpose. And so the purpose of most veins is to take waste from cells in exchange for the energy the cells get from the arteries. And so emphasis on the word most here, because remember, not all veins have deoxygenated blood. It's just that most veins do. And so taking this into account, we recognize that the veins don't need to be as thick-walled as arteries due to the fact that they have different purposes and due to the fact that they handle less pressure since they are not as close to the heart as arteries are, as well as the fact that they are not getting the same amount of pressure as arteries are. And so therefore they have thinner walls. Now let's talk about the structure of a vein. Now let's dive into the structure of a vein. And so as you can see here, there are only 5 crucial walls because The vein, as we discussed before, does not handle as much pressure as an artery, and so doesn't need as many walls as an artery does. And as we can see here, the 5 walls are divided into 3 sections: the tunica interna, tunica media, and tunica externa. And the tunica interna is composed of the endothelial wall and the subendothelial wall. And so the roles here are quite similar to those of an artery. Here, the endothelial wall just makes sure that there's a smooth lining for the blood to flow through and that there aren't any clots forming. The subendothelial wall just provides support. And as you can see here, the subendothelial wall is quite thin in this vein because there isn't much support needed. And so lastly, we also have these valves in the tunica interna. Um, we have these valves in the veins because these valves make sure that there aren't any backflows of blood happening. So, for example, if in your legs, if there's blood flowing upwards, well, it's going to be really hard to make sure that the blood isn't going back down. And so these valves help ensure that after every flowing of blood, the blood isn't going downwards, it just keeps going up. And so what these valves do is that they close so that the blood cannot flow back down. Then for the tunica media, we have the smooth muscle. And so what this smooth muscle does is when needed only, it contracts depending on the stimuli that it receives. And so this isn't very often because it doesn't really need to contract as much as an artery does since it only has very passive or very low pressures. And then lastly, we have the tunica externa, and we have the connective tissue, which just supports the vein and then anchors it to nearby tissue, and it provides protection to the vein. And then lastly, we have vasa vasorum, which are just vessels for the vessels, and it provides nutrients to the veins and makes sure that everything is functioning properly. And so this is the structure of a vein. And so now lastly, let's get into the structure of the capillaries. So before we get started with the structure, let's just start with the purpose. And the purpose of a capillary is to make sure that it infuses waste products and diffuses oxygen so that the tissue can be nourished. And so one really cool thing about a capillary is that it's so small, so thin that one blood cell can pass through it at a time. Like all the blood cells have to be in a single file line to be able to pass through a capillary. And so that's just something I found really cool. And basically the structure of a capillary is just a single layer of endothelial cells, and this helps it fulfill its function. So this is why the structure of the capillary is as it is. And so lastly, let's just compare these 3 vascular structures to get a more deeper understanding of the differences and similarities between the 3. So this is a comparison chart that I just created for the 3 vascular structures. And here we have size, number of walls, strength and thickness, and then purpose. And so size and number of walls and then strength and thickness are kind of all the same, so I'm just going to review them at once. The artery is the biggest because it has 7 walls, and so it is really strong to be able to maintain and handle the pressures of blood that is going through it. And then a vein is kind of like medium because it has 5 walls. It's not as layered as an artery, and it doesn't have to handle and manage as much pressure as an artery does. And so that's the reason for the creation of the vein that way. And then lastly, we have the capillary, which as we just reviewed is like really, really tiny. Like one red blood cell can fit through it at once. It's made up of one wall, which is like the endothelial cells, and it's not really made to be strong. It's just made for diffusion and infusion of oxygen and waste. And then the purpose of the 3 is the artery. It makes sure that the blood is taken away from the heart, whether that is oxygenated or deoxygenated. The vein takes blood to the heart. The capillary diffuses nutrients and waste to and from tissue. And so, yeah, this is a comparison chart. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching. I would just like to thank my parents and my friends for supporting me throughout this. And I'd like to thank Canva.com for helping me create this presentation and Microsoft Clipchamp for helping me editing this video. And thank you all. I hope this helped everyone understand anatomy a little bit better. See you next time. Bye.